Good evening, good afternoon everyone. I'm Rachel Tranter and I'm one of the trustees of the Commonwealth Heritage Forum. Very warm welcome to this talk this evening. This is the fifth talk in a series which Nicolette Duckham, who's here this evening, has put together, focusing on cemeteries and burial grounds in the Commonwealth. So yes, perhaps Nicolette, you can even answer the questions as well at the end. So very warm welcome to you all and to our speaker this evening, Antonia Malan, who's going to be talking to us about the grave encounters at the Cape of Good Hope. Antonia has lived in South Africa since 1973. She studied archaeology, gained her PhD, and this particular talk is focusing on the story of the graves in the Green Point at Cape Town. So I think without further ado, I will hand over to our speaker, Antonia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for the introduction, and hello to everybody. Thank you for clocking in. Just to warn you, if I suddenly disappear, it's because we are in what's known as load shedding in Cape Town, which basically means the lights go out on a fairly irregular basis. But we'll carry on and see how we go. So I think in the recent context of the previous talks in this series, this story is much more about the encounters with the bones than with memorials. Just to orientate those of you who aren't familiar with the Cape, this is Table Mountain. We're looking from the south towards Table Valley, which is this area. The shores of Table Bay carry on around, and there on the left here is, I'll be talking about certain places, such as the shoreline, Fort Knocker, which was a part of the defense system, the castle, the town itself, Amsterdam Battery, and Signal Hill, which is this little mountain here. There are also three main periods to note. The pre-colonial or the contact period, when passing European ships called here to get fresh water, to barter for fresh meat from the local people. And the Dutch East India Company, who annexed the Cape in 1652, then the first British occupation in 1795, and then it was a British colony after 1814. So the shores around and the dunes around Table Bay were very practical places to bury the dead. You could get 6 feet under in the sands. Human remains are still being exposed during coastal building developments. This picture actually shows a typical Khoi burial in about 1780. The flex body is wrapped in a skin kaross. The corpse would probably be buried in an upright position in a shaft, which would then be topped with stones. The Dutch East India Company occupied Table Bay in 1652, built a fort and a garden for fresh produce to supply their ships and those of the other countries. They also acquired livestock, well, stole it mostly, to start their own herds. The garrison grew into a permanent settlement for free burghers who serviced the busy port, and the hinterland was colonized by farmers who supplied the company with produce. The entire economy was underpinned by slave labor from Africa, India, and the Indies, and both the company and private people owned slaves. The formal cemetery was laid out for the company militia in 1720. Then the Freiburgers, who were members of the Dutch Reformed Church, were allocated a cemetery during a smallpox epidemic in 1755. The company was a mercantile monopoly, and so the Dutch Reformed Church was its official and only church. This picture is viewed from Signal Hill by Johannes Schumacher, who was the artist who accompanied Robert Jacob Gordon, who was a commander of the Cape. He did amazing, I don't know if any of you are familiar with his paintings. It's an extraordinary series of very literal depictions of the Cape, extraordinary things. So this picture from Signal Hill, dated 1777, also shows rectangular shapes to the left of these two walled cemeteries. And we only saw those once we had high resolution images. And it's extraordinary to think how much of our earlier research was based on rather poor copies of copies. And when we got high resolution images, how our world was completely transformed. Rather, as archaeologists' worlds have been transformed by Google Earth, our lives are transformed by wonderful images. So there we have the formal cemeteries, but there's also something going on here. But over the years, there have been decades of encounters with graves all around Table Bay. And this 1884 map shows just the narrow strip of land below Signal Hill, here's Signal Hill, where some of the most significant sites are found. And these include formal Christian and Muslim cemeteries, as well as unmarked graves. This map also shows that by the 1880s, the edge of the old town, which is this vertical street on the left, aptly called Buitengracht or Outer Canal, this was no longer a boundary by the late 19th century. Building blocks have crept across around the corner, and the old burial grounds are engulfed in the new town. So after freedom of religion in the 1780s, various Christian churches were allocated their own cemeteries. So here's the military burial ground, and then there's the burgher burial ground. We then have a Lutheran one, an Anglican one, and so on and so forth. So there was one for slaves and heathens as well, although in fact many of the slaves practiced Islam. There was a pauper's burial ground. This is Amsterdam Battery. In this area behind Amsterdam Battery, between Amsterdam Battery and the mountain and the Somerset Road, we'll come back to that. It was where everybody, it was the gemeente, the gemeentegrond for ordinary people. And it was known as the Witsands, and it spread across a sort of wasteland behind Amsterdam Battery. It was described as desolate, neglected, disease-ridden. This was according to the rather purple prose of the 19th century journalists and officials. It was once believed that miasmas caused outbreaks of plague and other pestilences. But by the 1890s, there was a better understanding of infections, and the authorities decided that no more burials should take place in the town, and these unwanted remains must make way for the living. This ban on burials in the ground caused a major uproar in the Muslim community. The riots that took place were unprecedented. One of the problems was that the Muslim community lived around Signal Hill largely, and the process of burials was that you carried the body on to the burial ground on foot. And so by preventing burials near where people lived, it created an enormous problem. It was also part of a political moment where the Muslim community was trying to hang on to its civic rights, which was slowly being eroded. So the whole issue around burials and non-burials was a very political thing back in the 1890s. So what happened then was that the official cemeteries, these ones, the remains were exhumed and taken off for burial elsewhere. But the ones in between were forgotten and ignored. This was very convenient for developers. And this is an ongoing theme in the story of the burials here. The plots were allocated, the formal cemeteries here were allocated to be only for places of public benefit. Institutions could build there, schools could build there, or there were gardens could be planted there. There was some acknowledgement that this previously sacred ground should be acknowledged, but that did not go for the case of the people buried in between these places. So what happened was that the wheel of forgetting turned again and again in this area. It's prime development. The Slums Acts of the 1930s, then the apartheid removals of the 1970s, were aimed to expel the living people, to demolish their houses and businesses from being in an inconvenient place. And from the 1980s, large and tall government buildings and business buildings signaled modernity and progress. And then in the 1990s, the waterfront development brought more money and rebuilding projects to rejuvenate the area's remaining rather seedier patches along Somerset Road. Which brings us now to the two major encounters 10 years apart. In 1994, graves were discovered exposed on a building site in Coburn Street off Somerset Road. Here's Somerset Road. Permission was granted for volunteers to archaeologically remove the human remains over the Christmas break. It was the first time that so many interments were revealed across a site rather than individual finds. And later graves were dug into earlier ones, suggesting it had been long in use. It was clearly a burial ground, not individual graves. Subsequently, we started to conduct research to find out who could have been buried there. And there was a series of academic research. There was a lot of theses, some theses were written, and articles were published on the findings. Though these, I meant to point out, these blue blocks are the formal cemeteries. So the next thing that happened was at Prestwich Street site, which is this square, a block away, was revealed 10 years later in 2004, after buildings were demolished for a redevelopment on a much larger property. It exposed numerous graves again, and this was no doubt part of the same burial ground. But this time, the discovery occurred in a different context. It was the context of the post-apartheid democratic political regime and new inclusive heritage legislation. And this time, the decision to remove the human remains became a cause célèbre, with vociferous protests, robust debate. and we shall talk about that a little bit more later. So who was buried there? Our research continued to focus on who may have been buried there, but we could find no specific information. We assumed that many were local people who were, for various reasons, were not eligible to be buried in the military or the denominational cemeteries. For instance, those who weren't Christians or could not afford the cemetery fees, or were strangers passing through the port. This would include local poor, the slaves, servants. It could include anybody. It may have been hospital patients. The old Somerset Hospital, built in 1818, next to the Lutheran Cemetery, cared for seamen and all the people of the town under the benevolent Dr. Samuel Bailey, a wonderful character. He was a surgeon and a registered man midwife. He was constantly involved in trying to deal with insolvency. He pestered the authorities for funds, and he oftentimes was seeking free burial space near the hospital. It could have been Dutch and British East India Company crews and their passengers, as well as troops on their way to and from the East. They could have died while visiting the town, or if they'd been sent to the company hospitals. The Cape of Good Hope was also known as the Cape of Storms, and shipwrecks were common. The remains of men believed to be from the Waterloo were found buried near Fort Knocker on the shores of Table Bay. There was evidence that some were slaves. Isotopic analysis of people who had modified teeth by which I mean their incisors had been shaped into different shapes, which was not a pig custom. And isotopic analysis of their bones showed that their diet had been different to that would if they'd been living in the Cape. In other words, they had come from more tropical areas. So it was therefore the correlation led to the result that these were most probably slaves with the modified teeth and with the isotopic analysis of the bones. So we were dealing with a burial place for the people of Cape Town and others, probably from about 1720 to 1850. 1850 would be when the urban blocks were fully developed with buildings erected on very shallow footings over the burial grounds. These late 18th and mid 19th century images show women or their descendants from regions of the Cape Colony, from East Africa and Asia. They worked as domestic servants, washerwomen, wet nurses, hawkers, seamstresses, cooks, and so on. But of course, the most direct evidence came from the graves themselves that had been archaeologically excavated and systematically recorded. And not all were. Coburn Street and Prestwich Street and one or two others were systematically exhumed. But even this process was by no means ideal, given very difficult circumstances of the work, such as opposition, lack of time and resources. Volunteers form the backbone of the archaeological team. Archaeology students, academic staff, and researchers all had to pile in to help with this project. At Prestwich Street alone, there were about 3,000 individuals. Some buried alone, others in pairs, others in groups. This example that I'm showing of a record sheet was filled in on site and shows what was found and where, and gives 3D coordinates. The objects that were found in the burials were later curated and catalogued. But note that since 2004, when Prestwich Street was discovered, no further study has been permitted on the actual human remains found in the area. All we have are on the site records. These burial goods were found with Khoi-style burials, and they're not relevant for the talk this evening, but I just thought that you might be interested to see them. They are about 1,000 years old. So there are broken grindstones, a tortoise shell bowl with traces of ochre still there. There's a stone ochre grinder, also with ochre still on it. An earthenware pot. There's also a shell pendant and ostrich eggshell beads. I put in a picture of this much earlier. I mean, this is 70,000 years old. It's a stone tool, a beautifully made steel bay point. This was found by itself on an old beach surface. So this is just to show that the area has been used for burials for so long, but what we were looking at is a much recent occurrence. However, beads were found in the later burials and with several individuals. They're mostly glass trade beads. Some were homemade from clay pipe stems or marine shells. However, their presence doesn't necessarily identify who wore them. They're usually traditionally associated with African culture. And there were Africans in Cape Town, including slaves from Madagascar and Mozambique. There were also convicts and prisoners, migrant workers from more distant parts of the colony, who were brought to Cape Town to work on the harbour and as labour on civic works. Buttons were the most common artifact and were found in positions on the skeleton that could indicate a garment or a bag or a pocket. Some were silver. The ones at the bottom were GR, where GR is embossed or engraved. King George IV reigned from 1820 to 30, which gave us a nice date. Buttons were even used as currency or exchange during the colonial period. Those bone discs on the right are undergarment buttons or button backs. There were personal items such as rings with some people and coins. This was puzzling, as these were probably poor people who were being buried in unsecured graves. And after the devastating smallpox epidemic of 1755, there were strict instructions to bury those who died from infectious disease in their clothes. But maybe grave goods may have been intentionally buried too. Were people being buried with items for the afterlife? Here's a table knife and spoon, a penknife wrapped in cloth. A careful interment, especially the provision of a costly coffin, suggests that a person's friends and relatives cared for them, however poor they were. Indeed, the archival records tell of imposing limits to the number of people who could attend a slave burial, presumably an important social occurrence. Published reports on slave burials in the Americas, Caribbean, St. Helena, and other places assume that grave goods had a ritual meaning and purpose. As a note of caution, here are some images and items typically associated with men. But smoking pipes, tinder boxes were also buried with women. One woman was buried in a military jacket, judging by the type and position of the buttons found with her. There are several enigmas. A woman was buried with an empty solid silver snuff box with initials and a date scratched on the base. But the silver needle case had a different initials on the cap. Did this woman own them or acquire them in another way? And who was MHK and what happened in 1764? This image of a Madagascan seamstress was painted by Lady Anne Barnard, who lived at the Cape for a few years at the end of the 19th century, a very keen observer and diarist of life. This man had a bag buried with him containing a necklace made of fish vertebrae which had been coloured, a knife, an ostrich eggshell bead, and 2 limpet shells. And this man was buried clutching the lid of a locally made earthenware kitchen pot. The demographics of Prestwick Street and Coburn Street reflected a normal population distribution for that time, with women, men, children, all ages. High mortality of children was normal at that time, and it was evident. There were neonates and children with disabilities such as rickets. In contrast to Coburn and Prestwick Streets, however, the burials rescued during development at the Marina residential site, closer to the harbour, were mostly men, some with healed or fatal injuries from accidents. There were fewer artifacts. You can also see how they were buried very closely packed in a shallow burial ground, possibly over a shorter time than Coburn and Prestwick Streets. You can see the heavy trucks still busy carrying earth away in the background. As mentioned before, there are signs of slavery in these encounters. At Fort Knocker, modified teeth were associated with burials from a slave ship. These features were also found in Coburn and Prestwick Streets, with the example here showing sharpened incisors. An early 19th century newspaper advert describes the slave Rotterdam as tall and slender with sharp pointed teeth. There's currently a master's student looking at these advertisements and trying to recreate physical descriptions and how they can be interpreted as identifying people. Colonists were generally pretty nervous of their slaves. During the 18th century, they outnumbered settlers in Cape Town. In the 19th century, especially after the British oceanic slave trade was banned in 1807, the legislators wrote a string of ordinances and acts to control the freedom and movement of underclasses, peaking before slaves were finally emancipated in 1838. For instance, from 1809, tags with registered numbers had to be worn visibly on the heads of slaves who worked as hawkers and coolies, peddling the produce from the market gardens. These ones are homemade tags found in burials. The infamous Gallows Hill lay closer to the harbour than Somerset Road. This mound was where the remains of executed people were exposed as a deterrent in full view of ships at anchor in the bay. This image shows the hangman in about 1798. The central image shows the awful reality of being sentenced to work in irons, a common phrase in court records. These rings were welded onto the lower limbs and had to be buried with the victim, unlike the shackles that could be unfastened. The harbour and major civic works were built with convict labour, some of whom had been imprisoned on the borders of the colony for minor theft. A master's student used the on-site records to explore patterns, the correlation between burial style, location, and associated artifacts. For instance, niche burials with the body lying on its side were never associated with coffins or artifacts except pins. This hints at Muslim beliefs and practices. The graves were also oriented to Mecca, concentrated in areas slightly apart from the others, who would have been infidels. On the left of this slide are Muslim-style associations. The corpse is carried on foot to the grave, wrapped in a shroud. It lies on its side in the grave, facing away from the shaft, and into a niche that protects it from the falling soil. There's no coffin, nor grave goods. Christian-style burials are where the body lies supine, sometimes in a coffin, and may have associated artifacts. In the example on the right, where the first burial has been disturbed by the next, a large cartwheel penny is laid on the eye, a common European practice. This coin also provides a nice date after which the burial took place, 1797. Finally, I will touch on other encounters. I've hinted that not all was simple during the encounters with graves in Cape Town. In the past, when builders and municipal workers came across human remains while digging trenches, they usually kept quiet. The burials at Marina Residential were only reported when a very nervous security guard noticed a skull and told his superior. Before that moment, tons of earth had been trucked away from the site. When the large exposed burial ground at Prestwich Street came to the public's attention, there was an eruption of fascination, horror, and violent objections to the exhumation of human remains. Many people were simply curious and wanted to come and see the site. Others greeted their removal with anger and protests. Public outrage was expressed by a range of individuals, groups, and institutions. It was described as the discoveries that divided, as opinions strongly split over what to do. The slogan "Hands Off Prestwich" was revived from the Hands Off District 6 campaign, when objectors to the removal of families and demolition of their houses in the 1970s, and by the same activists. Yet again, the people of Cape Town were being humiliated, disrespected, and abused by the authorities. There was also much being published in the late 90s about colonial period atrocities linked to the theft of skeletons to study race and intelligence. Yet again, it seemed that scientists were seeking access to skeletons for academic purposes. The developer, the archaeological team, and the newly established Heritage Agency were caught, surprised, and helpless in the clamour. Work at Prestwich Street was stopped and started over 2 years of debate and legal wrangling. There were no financial means available to expropriate the land so that the burials could remain there. It was private property with legal development rights. Despite a long series of public consultations and appeals up to national ministerial level, vigils and prayers, anger and trauma, the remaining burials were eventually removed and all have been placed in a custom-made Prestwich Memorial on Somerset Road. The minister decided that the bones must not be further studied, and this remains the situation today. Thus, no DNA studies can be done. And while legally we had to consult with the direct descendants, we are unlikely to ever know the identities or names of the people buried in the unmarked graves. But as the campaigners pointed out, that's not the point. We do not need to know. Rather, They symbolically represent the ancestors of all the people of Cape Town, and particularly those who were previously exploited and ignored in the past. There are no plans for the human remains to be reburied. They're becoming forgotten again. There's a cafe in the memorial, but are the customers aware of the bones resting around them? Much has been written and published on the matter, and it continues to attract some academic interest. In 2017, we published a book that put the Prestwich Street site into the broader context of other grave encounters in Greenpoint, Cape Town. However, if you would like a copy, I have to bring it to the Netherlands or the UK in my luggage because our postal system has completely collapsed and couriers are very expensive. But I'm very happy to do that if anybody would like a copy. Here are my fellow authors, Tim Hart, Liesbeth Skitterkatter, and Dave Halkett. For those of you who may wish to trace people buried in South Africa, the Genealogical Society of South Africa has recorded a growing collection of grave inscriptions. The other website refers to the formal Somerset Road cemeteries. The South African Heritage Agency has a burial site unit to manage the sites of conflict, including the Anglo-Boer War, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission manages the World War graves. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk, and I really look forward to attending more forum events. I think they're fascinating. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Antonia. That was really fascinating, and thanks for all the information and slides that you shared. Really fascinating talk. We don't have any questions in the chat as yet. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to either ask on audio or pop in the chat? Please do come forward now. Perhaps while we're waiting for people to think of questions, Antonia, could you talk a little bit more about the book and what it comprises?
It's an introduction as to how burials got into the area and how they gradually got removed. So in a way, it's a little potted history of Cape Town, a part of Cape Town, which hasn't been very much researched. And it's also a compilation of all the publications which have come out around this issue as well. It's beautifully designed by our friend Neil Rush, and the artifacts are illustrated as well. I do have to say that very little research has been done since 2004 into the archaeological record. So there's some really interesting projects for people who may be interested as well. I see Dave Halkett, are you there still? Maybe you have something to add.
Hello, Antonia. Thanks for the talk. Just to say that the bones don't go away. In fact, at this very moment in time, I'm trying to organize to have the remains of the Marina residential burials moved to the Prestwich Memorial. The medical school where the Marina residential remains were taken years ago in 2000 for forensic work, have been there ever since. But now the medical school is doing building operations, and we're trying to get them into the Prestwich Memorial. proving to be a bit of a problem because the facility is not particularly well kept, and there's a concern that if these remains go in there, they will suffer the poor conditions.
Yes, I think the point is that the issues which were raised in 2004 have not been resolved.
Exactly.
In many, all sorts of ways. It was something which took everybody by surprise, and the problems are not resolved. We do know that there are still, under the buildings in the area which have not been demolished yet, there are still burials.
Antonia, Carol has asked, well, a bit more information about why the research stopped in 2004. Is that because of funding?
No, it was a ministerial. What happened was that the whole case Prestwich case went up to ministerial level, and there was a tribunal. There were various appeals, and it ended up with a national ministerial tribunal. And the report of the tribunal said that no further studies must take place on the bone.
Right.
Nobody's challenged it since then, which is it's interesting and a curious thing. Everything here is charged with difficulties. And I have to say, you know, stepping back now, rather waiting to see what happens, whether descendants of the people who might be there might ask for permission to study the bones. That is a possibility. There are a lot of, you know, anthropology students and people interested in the bones who might wish to study them, but whether they will take that plunge or whether it'll ever happen, we wait to see. You know, it's a curious position which is very peculiar to here, to this place. Certainly as far as we are concerned, Dave will back me up here. We would be the last people who would wish to ask to study the bones.
And Carol just had a follow-up about whether they gave any reason for that conclusion.
It was a peculiarly inadequate report. It was written during a period and by people where there wasn't any very well-informed or cohesive approach to a problem like this. Yeah, and it's remained the same. For those who are interested, I mean, you just Google Prestwich Street and you will find a string of articles and theses looking at it from all sorts of points of view. But as far as a push to continue the research is concerned, nothing, no.
So I've got Peregrine who's got his hand up. Do you want to come off mute, Peregrine?
Right. Thank you. I slightly sort of tangential connection, really, but I'd reminded did remind me slightly of a talk by Linda Sturtz on the Kingston Spring Path, which was a burial ground for enslaved people in the 18th century in Kingston, Jamaica. That was also used as a gathering place to honor their heritage. And I was wondering whether that there's any evidence of that also being the case here. Olaudah Equiano, who was an African descended man who wrote a powerful anti-slavery narrative, and he describes in 1771, he was surprised when he came to Spring Path. I was surprised to see the number of Africans who were assembled together on Sundays, particularly at a large commodious place called Spring Path. Here, each different nation of Africa met and danced after the manner of their own country. And they were still retained most of, obviously, the Caribbean, so it's very different from South Africa. I just wondered whether the burial grounds were also used as a place of gathering, a memorial.
Well, not no. There's no evidence of that. Also, I didn't actually explain the issue of slavery. What happened was, because we had already recognized clues, skeletal clues for identifying slaves from Fort Knocker, they were the first ones who could be identified at Coburn Street. And so it became known, it became in the papers, it was the slave burial ground, which it wasn't. Yes, there were slaves there, but it was never a slave burial ground as such, because everybody was buried there. And I think this is where the difference, where it got very confused. So if there was no particular evidence that slaves identified with this burial ground, or certainly not in the records. And if anything, it's the Muslim burial grounds which have attracted that sort of attention, as far as ritual visiting and protecting them, and that there's a whole fascinating layer of what should we say, burial history in the Cape to do with Islam. There's the so-called sacred circle of Islam. There are burials up on the mountain. Sorry, I could go on. That's actually another talk. I could probably talk about Muslim burial grounds as well. So those are the ones that are rather attracted the attention of you know, the people who were displaced by history. Has been much more the Muslim history rather than slave history. As far as I know, there are no specific slave burial grounds associated with slaves, although there is a so-called slave and heathen burial ground, a little portion of this area. But I don't know of any of slave descendants actually identifying with them.
Thank you very much.
So we have a question from Lewis about the hats in the engravings that you showed. He's asking, you know, they look Chinese, but can you talk a little bit more about
the African burial ground in America, but the circumstances are very different there.
Okay, so I think earlier on we had Nigel said, do you think you will have access to the remains in the future? So I think you did touch on this about people maybe researching their family history, but yeah, do you want to say any more about accessing remains in the future?
Yes, what would be, I mean, we have well-established protocols on applying to study human remains here, which are, because of this unusual ministerial decision, this only applies to the remains from Greenpoint. And as I say, I think if somebody applied to study them, they would presumably have to approach the minister to reconsider, or today's minister, the department, to reconsider that decision and go through the normal application process. There's theoretically nothing to prevent it, but in practice, nobody seems to be doing it.
Right, lovely. Graham's got his hand up. Graham, do you want to come off mute? And
Yes, thank you. I was only able to join a little bit later, so I'm not sure if this was mentioned or not. But Antonia, contextualizing the site at Greenpoint internationally or globally, how usual or unusual is it to find layered burials like this going all the way back to First Nation burials? Is that something you looked at the time?
Graham, that's actually a bit. I wondered whether to put those slides in. It's the First Nation burials are a bit of a red herring. They were already here a long time ago, as they are all the way around the shore. Okay, it just so happened that the later burial ground was in the same place. So I was a little bit worried that we'd get confused there.
I was just wondering to what extent, because I've heard of cases in Australia and other places where you have places that have become traditional for burials over a long period and going back quite a long time. And I just wondered, in context with Greenpoint, how usual, unusual is that in the broader context?
As far as we know, the burials that we've been looking at, or that they are, they're just of the more recent period.
Okay.
If that answers your question.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks.
But the trouble is, when you get isolated discoveries, you don't have a broader context. They're just isolated discoveries. It's very difficult to see patterns or to make assumptions, which is why the work in the Greenpoint area has been so fascinating. Because there's so many. I mean, I haven't even talked about the other ones. Just focused on these two.
Brilliant. I think, does anybody else have any final questions? Carol's sort of written a follow-up to the discussion we were having earlier around the decision of the government. And she says, do you think if an individual or individuals holding national public recognition could use their advocacy to change the stalling situation?
Sorry, I don't quite understand. I think
Carol, do you want to come off mute and explain your question? Are you there? I think she's just talking about, could somebody kind of, change that situation by advocating for change?
Yes. Yes, as I say, in theory, there is absolutely nothing to prevent a normal process happening, except the slightly complicated thing that there is I don't even know legally how binding that ministerial decision was. Nobody's actually tested that yet. As I say, there are all sorts of loose ends which remain. I think somebody should, because it's a peculiar situation. Apart from anything else, the remains themselves are in a limbo. The ossuary, the memorial ossuary is not a satisfactory resolution. It doesn't comply with normal repository requirements under our management systems. So it's a complicated issue.
Hi, good afternoon. I was the one that answered the question. I'm from the United States. I was just wondering, it always happens that when you bring a renowned individual in who is world known, or maybe a little bit less, that brings public interest and knowledge, and it kind of sets, I don't know, a red flag off, and then it sort of like starts as a small snowball and gets bigger. That if you bring somebody that's public and said, okay, I want to be an advocate for this situation, that might spark. And because I'm just puzzled by this whole, I think, grouping of individuals, that you're not able to exactly find out why it's stalling. That's all. I just like an Oprah Winfrey or something. I mean, over in the States, over in the States.
Your question's very interesting because at the time, one of our huge, the limitations literally of moving human remains was funding and people to do it. And one of the things that became very apparent was that there would have been, if we had sought it, there would have certainly have been international interest for non-South Africans, I think, to have got involved, to have invested in helping and so on and so forth. But we were very clear that that was completely inappropriate given the circumstances.
Okay.
It was completely inappropriate at that time,
Mhm,
at that political and legal time.
mhm.
So that was an interesting thing as well, that a sort of undercurrent, that normally, under normal circumstances, if you had this, I mean, because the size, the scale of these fines is unparalleled as far as I know. And the context, certainly, the colonial context is unparalleled. So it wouldn't have been difficult to make it an international project.
Yes.
But it was inappropriate. So that's
Okay.
never happened. And I suspect that the same would pertain now. It would be incredibly difficult. Those attitudes still remain. The attitudes towards science and
Mhm.
stuff like that. If that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. And this is absolutely fascinating. I find this.
It is.
It is absolutely. So thank you very much. I really am enjoying it.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. It's been great having so much discussion. I think we've answered everything. Hopefully we've answered everything. If there are any final questions, let me know. Otherwise, just to let you all know that we've got another talk in this series coming up on the 14th of December, focusing on St John's Cemetery, which is in Parramatta, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Nicola, in Australia. So that's the 14th of December, and I've popped the Eventbrite link in the chat for you. So I think, yeah, without further ado, I'll just thank Antonia for a really fascinating talk. Thanks so much for all the time you spent preparing that. Really appreciate it. And the recording will be available on the website. So for those of you that joined us slightly late, you can log in and to the website and see the earlier part of the talk. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording now.